Oh, man. Big tour.
Okay, well, I'll tell you something, Mr. Lewis. My earliest memory of you is when I was in high school. And I was in high school from '03 to '07. And I think once I started playing varsity and I started, having a couple of good games scoring wise, I remember you, coming with the microphone. Was the dictaphone at that time? Trying to come
Yes,
and get
it
some
was.
statements from you. And I was like, man, I felt it sort of helped me feel like I had arrived a little bit as a student athlete. And your face just became one that I grew more and more familiar with. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, all right, I got to put in some work tonight so I can talk to Mr. Lewis. I can talk to Barry. But when did you know that this was what you wanted to be in when it comes to sports writing and everything in that space? When did you know, this is what I want to do?
Well, I realized at a very early age, probably about 11 or 12, 13, around that time, because I loved playing sports. I won the first golf tournament I ever entered.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I ever got my name in the paper. So I thought that was pretty cool. And so I thought I might have a future in that. And I love playing baseball, love playing basketball, and football somewhat too. But once I got probably in the junior high years, I realized I went to Edison. And when I saw there were so many great athletes there, and I soon realized I don't think I'm not that good athletically. My future is not in playing sports. I think I wanted to stay in sports. I wanted to make a career in sports. So I realized soon that if I was going to stay in sports and make a living at it, it would probably be as a member of the media. At that time, I didn't know whether it was going to be broadcasting or print. And as it's turned out, although I've worked for newspapers for about 40 years, I've wound up doing a little bit of both. A little bit of broadcasting as well as a lot of print, obviously, being in it for 40 years.
Sure. But staying in that sports realm for just a minute, was golf the very first sport that you picked up?
It would well, back when I was really young, is basically whatever sport was in season.
Oh yeah.
I participated in it. I participated in everything. It'd probably be because my dad. Golf was probably his favorite sport. He was a really good golfer, good enough that he competed in one PGA Tour event. So he was a scratch golfer, and so that was probably the first sport I actually participated in. But soon after, baseball and basketball, and played football. I was really blessed that my dad was sort of ahead of his time. We had a large backyard, larger backyard than most of my friends. And so he turned the backyard first. It was a multi-sport backyard. He, ahead of his time, this was talking about the 60s and 70s, right. Before everyone else was doing it, he put in a 3-hole golf course in the backyard, a chipping course. I mean, the holes would be like 40 to 50 yards. And so that was my first sports experience at actually participating. But then when it was baseball season, he turned it into a baseball field. Not hard balls. We played with plastic baseballs and bats.
There you go.
Otherwise, it'd be a lot of broken windows because we would be parking. We'd be hitting balls over the fence all the time. And then in basketball season, we had a nice little basketball court. And then in football season, he would chalk the field to 100 feet, not 100 yards.
Right.
And we had strips of AstroTurf in the backyard. And we had lights installed, so just because when it became nighttime didn't mean we stopped playing. Right. So we had friends from all over the neighborhood would play, and it was just a really fun time. So I think it's a long answer to your question, but I grew up loving all the sports, and wish I could have played better at them, but I just wasn't as athletically gifted, at least for the large school level. Right. That would have allowed me to play varsity sports, and I'm glad at least I realized that at an early age so I could focus my so I could get to what I would be eventually doing, and that's writing and also broadcasting, because I practiced all those all the time when I was growing up. And I think just as an athlete would practice his craft for a future career or for his time in playing in high school or college and a future career thereafter, I was practicing being a writer, being a broadcaster, all the way back to when I was 11 or 12.
Man, you're not joking. Your dad was ahead of his time, because I've never heard anything like that. Basically, almost as if it's almost like it was a stage. Well, we just change it with the seasons. You know what I mean?
It was. I was really blessed. Of course, you don't realize how blessed you are until you're an adult and can look back at it. I was just basically having fun back then, and was taking it for granted somewhat. Although I knew, because my friends didn't really have backyards like that, I knew this is sort of special, and it was just a lot of fun growing up, and really cherish those memories.
Right. You have any siblings?
I do. I have a younger brother, Larry, who has been a teacher at McLean for 20 years now.
Hey.
He used to be the golf coach there.
All right.
And we worked together at the Tulsa Tribune newspaper for a few years, and then it folded, and then he went having a teaching career, but he still does a little writing.
There you
He
go.
works for a TU website, covering TU sports, our website covering TU sports. I think that's probably the proper way to refer to it. And he also covers high school football for us, a game every week, as part of our Tulsa World high school football coverage. And I've got two sisters who live in Jacksonville, Florida.
Man, now are you the oldest? That's what it sounds like.
I'm the oldest brother. My sisters are older.
Sister's older. That's all right there, man. It's like, I don't know. I got one brother, and then I got a bunch of cousins, because my mom's family is so big. So when as soon as you started talking about the big backyard and all the activities and sports that you and a bunch of the other kids from the community were able to get into, I'm like, I bet he grew up with some brothers and sisters too.
I did, although by the time the backyard came into being, into a multi-purpose sports field, my sisters, they were older than my brother and I, and so they had moved on to college and left. They were out of town by that point, so it was my brother and I who got to enjoy that backyard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when it comes to the work that you did, which coincides with the work that you now do, I gotta ask, were you always self-motivated, or where did you get your drive from? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I think I've always been pretty self-motivated. I consider myself a self-starter. As far as journalism is concerned, it was just something that I just started on to some extent. Obviously, I studied journalism in college, but I taught myself a lot before that, because after all, I was writing a lot of sports when I was 11, 12, and on throughout high school, just on my own. And so it's just because of my love for doing that. And also, I would be broadcasting games into my tape recorder. Like a lot of famous sportscasters will have said they've done. I did that same thing too. And because I really didn't know which direction I wanted to go, print or broadcast. And my mind was made up basically my junior year in college, where I thought I was leaning towards broadcast. And at that time, TU's radio station while I was in college, went a little bit of a transition. And they started playing classical music. And I got my script to do an audition there. And I was reading the script, and I respect all those. I respect classical music a lot, and it's beautiful music, but it's just not my thing.
Not your cup of tea.
And so I was doing the script, and I said, I can't envision myself. This isn't just going to be fun for me. I can't envision myself being in the studio if I pass the audition of just introducing all these classical music pieces. So
did you sabotage it?
No, I just walked away. I said, this is not for me. And so I was blessed. God blessed me with the opportunity a couple weeks later. An opening occurred at the University of Tulsa student newspaper. And the rest is history. I've been working on the yearbook already, so I've had that part of the print work done at University of Tulsa. But for the last 2 years I was there, I did both print and broadcast. Not print and broadcast, yearbook and newspaper. And that was a very exciting time because Nolan Richardson was just starting to, he was early in his time as University of Tulsa's basketball coach. So I sort of was able to enjoy that wave of excitement.
Oh, yeah, man. He had a heck of a run during that time, man. But you said something, and I got to stay with it before I forget. So what did some of those earlier sports pieces that you would write when you were like 11 and 12 years old, what do you still remember what some of those looked and sounded like? And where I'm coming from with that question is, like, how much you must have been ahead of your time too, because how would you even know how to start formulating something like that at 11 and 12 years old? You know what I mean?
Well, I've always been an avid reader. There's a picture of myself with my mom. I think I was 3 or 4, and I was looking over her shoulder. She's reading the Tulsa Tribune. So, but we were both subscribers of the World and Tribune. That just happened to be the Tribune. And little did I know, like 20 years later, I'd be starting my career at the Tribune. But anyway, I was reading even before starting school, formal education, which, and so I read a lot growing up. Read the paper every day, the sports stories, because I was into sports. And so when I was 11 or 12, I just felt, hey, I want to do this. I want to try it out. And when I was 12, I started a daily paper called the St. Louis Cardinals Report. That's my favorite baseball team. And I just started writing it every day. Had one subscriber, basically, my brother, is a Cardinals fan. And I disciplined myself to produce a paper every day during the season. The off season, we went weekly, once a week. And back then it was a challenge because you didn't have all the sites that you do now to get a box score. I mean, because now you can just go on the internet anytime and you can call up a box score, type up a box score. If I was going to do a box score or a game story for that matter for the St. Louis Cardinals Report, I was going to have to listen to the game, or in rare instances when it was on TV, watch the game on TV, or in rare instances, go to the game.
There you go.
So I disciplined myself, and I did it for 4.5 years. And sometimes I made more than one copy if one of my friends wanted a copy. Back then, you had to do copying paper. That was just painful, so hard to do. Carbon paper. Right. And it was just a thrill when I got a typewriter so I could actually do it. And so the paper looked legible. Yeah. That was a great birthday present for my 13th birthday. And
I remember the typewriter too.
Yes, I thought, and bless my parents, because I gave myself deadlines every night. And my bedroom was next to their bedroom, and I know sometimes it was hard for them to go to sleep because I was banging away on the typewriter. And sometimes they say, hey, cut it off. But most of the times they let me just go away and write my stories on the St. Louis Cardinals game that night.
It sounds like they were super supportive. They said, all right, this kid loves something right here. He's got something, just let him go.
They were super supportive, and I'm so thankful for that support and all their love. And I gave myself situations that were like real life situations. I gave myself deadlines every night. A lot of times those deadlines would be like my natural bedtime. But even in the summertime, I said, okay, I'm giving myself a midnight deadline just for practice, real world practice at the age of 14 in real life situations. So I think that proved to be really valuable for later on. Now for the last 40 years when I've really been on deadline.
Boom, boom, boom. Okay, so what were the parameters though? How long did your stories have to be based on what, you know?
I gave myself parameters. It's usually probably the equivalent of 12 to 14, what would turn out to be nowadays 12 to 15 inches. I'd write 12 to 15 inch stories, basically a typical paper in the season. I'd write a game story.
Right.
I'd listen to the star of the game interview afterwards to get some quotes. If I had time before my deadline, then I would type out the major league standings, update them. Then I would have my projected starting lineup for the next day. And if it was at the start of a series, I would have complete rosters for the Cardinals and who their opponent was.
Very, very thorough.
That'd be a typical St. Louis Cardinals report. And it was, again, back then it was such a different time. And because if I didn't listen to the game or watch the game, there was no other way otherwise that you're going to get that story. Yeah. So I didn't have
social media, baby.
Right, no social media.
So who were some of the voices of your childhood from a broadcast analyst and commentator standpoint? I got some in my mind, too, that when I hear their voices, it immediately takes me back to when I was a kid. And even sometimes I make reference to them subconsciously whenever I'm doing this kind of work. You know what I mean?
From a broadcast standpoint, Jack Buck.
Okay.
You may have heard of his son, Joe.
Yep. With Joe Buck.
Yeah, Joe Buck. I like Joe Buck, too. But Jack Buck was one of my favorites all time. Grew up listening to him with the St. Louis Cardinals and learned a lot of baseball listening to Jack Buck and Harry Carey. They were broadcast partners on the Cardinals games. Of course, Harry Carey became more known later for his time with the Cubs. From a baseball standpoint, since the Cardinals were the team I listened to like virtually every day, 162 games practically every year, those were the voices I heard most. But on TV, there's some really classic broadcasters. Kurt Gowdy was the voice of baseball and AFL and then NFL football for NBC back then, and as well as NCAA basketball in the early years. He did it all, so he was enjoyed listening to him too. And of course, as you go throughout the years, now it's a real treat now because you get to listen to on Sirius Radio. You can listen to everybody, and I listened to some out of town announcers back then. I thought there's plenty of nights when I listened to the radio bring in 50,000 watt stations from all over America. And so I did hear a lot of interesting different broadcasts from not just the Cardinal games, but from here in Kansas City, Texas. Oh gosh, I could even pull in the Cincinnati broadcast, Cleveland Indians at the time broadcast. Even sometimes Chicago broadcast, Minnesota. You never know when it got late at night who you could pull in with your transistor radio.
You'd be out there trying stuff. Let me see what I can get.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the fun. And then later on throughout the years, of course, Bob Costas, I remember.
That's one of the ones from my childhood. I hear that voice right now.
Yes, KMOX, the voice of St. Louis. They did the Cardinals games. And so I remember listening to Bob Costas back when he was just starting the business, back when he was 21 or 22 in the mid-'70s. And I thought, I think he could go places. Yeah. And he would love Bob Costas. And throughout the years, of course, Al Michaels was a favorite. Legend. I loved Pat Summerall. There's just so many, but those are, I think, we're really treated right now to a lot of outstanding broadcasters.
Whenever you had your tape recorder in front of your mouth and you're doing your version of it, did you ever catch yourself intentionally or unintentionally sounding like some of those names?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think that's a natural. When you hear their style, that some of it's going to rub off on you. And as a hockey announcer, I mean, and the impact an announcer can have is just tremendous, because I learned a lot listening to the St. Louis Cardinals games throughout the years, just on Mike Shannon, who recently retired after 50 years. He taught, I mean, when it came to strategy, really good broadcasters can really teach you the game. When I was in the 70s again on KMOX, I became a big hockey fan because of their announcer, Dan Kelly. He was huge, because it was hard I wasn't really into hockey as much as the other sports until I heard him call a game. And then he taught me so much just by listening to him. And I think that's the impact a broadcaster can have, and hopefully, to some extent, a sports writer can have.
Sure. Speaking of, once you graduated college, what was your very first gig as an adult? What did you get into first, right away?
I was blessed because right at when I was graduating from the University of Tulsa, through connections I made at TU,
Right.
a job, I graduated in May of '83, and through my connections there, I I was told, Greg Derrick, who also did some writing for it, he was working part-time at the Tribune at the time, the evening paper.
Right.
And his brother was a full-time sports writer. He was on the staff part-time there, and he did some writing for the TU paper when I was sports editor there, and he told me there was going to be an opening at the end of the summer. And so, he asked me if I was interested. And I thought, oh, yes. Oh, my goodness, because usually the typical path, even if you do everything right, do a lot of internships and try to get your foot in the door places, when you graduate from college, you usually have to go to a small town newspaper and start from the bottom, so to speak, move away from home, start at the bottom, and then work your way up and hopefully impress some people. And then maybe 4 or 5, 6 years later, you can be hired by a big city newspaper. And here I was really blessed to get this opportunity. Not only get the opportunity, but hey, I could enjoy the summer and then interview for this position at the end of the summer. And so I guess they liked me enough, and I was hired that August on my parents' wedding anniversary. So I said, happy anniversary, Mom and Dad. I just got hired by the Tulsa Tribune. And again, I did it in a very unorthodox way, because most of the time, in order to even get hired by a small town paper, much less a big city paper,
Right.
you had to do internships and probably have worked for a paper, even do correspondent work, cover high school games on a Friday night prior to that.
Right.
That's the traditional way. I didn't do any of that. The only thing that was traditional that I did was work on TU student paper. So I had that going for me. But I got hired in August of '83 by the Tribune, and I stayed at the Tribune
Until it folded, right?
until it folded in '92. Stayed there long enough for Central to win a state title. That's in the last basketball season I covered for the Tribune. But anyway, I started at the bottom at the Tribune, but just glad to have a job. I started doing sports agate in the baseball page. That's how I broke in there, and covering and keeping. This was right up my alley because I've always been big into stats. I kept high school football stats that first fall in 1983, in which Troy Aikman's senior year at Henrietta, to put that in perspective. And so I starting at the very bottom, but just thrilled to be working at the Tribune, and there were such great writers there, such great writing talent, and it was really great for me to start at the bottom and just learn by. I mean, I've been learning from them previously because I read the paper all the time, but just to see them up close in action was really educational. Just incredible writing talent, starting with their sports editor, Mike Sal, and throughout the staff. And my first writing assignments, and it wasn't bylined, I got the bowling beat.
Oh, all right.
Right. I love bowling, but my first really beat there was the bowling beat. Did the bowler of the week. And so I thought I didn't get a byline for that. The first time I got a byline, and this was pretty amazing, they asked me if they didn't have anyone else to do it. This was in the spring of '84. And they asked me, Olympic champion Bob Mathias is coming into town. He was a 2-time decathlon champion from 1948 and 52. Can you cover it? Oh yeah, I can cover that. He was just gonna be stopping in town really briefly at the airport, and so the first byline interview story I ever did at the Tulsa Tribune was two-time decathlon champion Bob Mathias. So that was I was really nervous before that. Obviously, I said I didn't want to mess this up, but it turned out all right. And it was an Olympic year, so it was partly to promote some of the former Olympians. Came to town to promote the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, and another famous decathlon champion from more recent years that I interviewed in that time, in that era or in that time frame, was Bruce Jenner.
Wow.
Who was then known as Bruce Jenner.
It's getting legendary now, man. Jesus.
So I mean that was quite a thrill to interview such great athletes like that. And Bob Mathias had also gone on to become a congressman too. So he was quite well known back then. I think so that was quite a thrill. And then I just kept on getting more and more assignments after that. I guess I didn't mess it up because I kept on getting more. Graduated soon after. I was writing more and more and more, as well as I was still doing the sports agate.
Couldn't get far away from it. Let me ask you this though. Do you look at, considering how your trajectory was and how your journey went, do you look at the word experience differently? And where I'm coming from is I've been in some interviews before too, earlier in my head coaching career, and I would run into the thing, hey, great interview, but you haven't had, you don't have the experience, and it's like the only way to go get it is to go get it, and you sort of need somebody to take a chance on you. So how do you view that now? Saying you got the rub and it turned out to be a good one. But not everybody's Barry Lewis, though.
Yeah, I guess there's all different types of experience. I didn't have, I guess, quote, very much formal experience. And I was glad I started at the bottom in a fairly low pressure situation. Although if I had screwed up the sports agate, I wouldn't have gotten the future chances to do writing. Because every job's important. I think a lot of people looked at that agate page, but I think if I would have started at the paper and been given a regular beat, I think I would have been successful. But I think the transition to that was smoother because I got to move along slowly, building my way slowly up. But I think I was 21 when I was hired. At the Tribune. So I was a young graduate of college.
There you go.
And so I think people can be very experienced. There are some college graduates who've gotten a lot more experience than I did at TU who are ready to start off at a big city paper upon graduation. We have one of those who's starting out at the Tulsa World, started out the Tulsa World this football season, Dean Rule. He went right from OSU, then to an internship at the Oklahoman, and then onto our staff. And he was ready. You could tell just talking to him when we were doing interviews that he was ready for this opportunity. And then also seeing the work he had produced at OSU. So I think some people, experience comes in all different types and forms.
That's true.
And sometimes you're right. Sometimes the only way you can get that experience, and I'm still learning after 40 years.
Right.
But sometimes the only way to get that experience is actually doing it, no matter how much you study. I thought I was super prepared for the beats when I finally got more advanced or I shouldn't say more advanced beats, but high school beat at the Tribune. When I was 24, a couple years after starting, I was given the high school basketball beat. And but even on that beat, even though I thought I was really prepared to do that, some of the things you only learn by doing. Right. And just about every beat I've been on, that's the way you get experience is by actually doing it, because there's only so much you can learn in the classroom, no matter how good your instructor is. And I had some really good instructors through the years.
Got to be field work though at some point.
Yes.
Were your veterans good to you? from a relationship standpoint, when you were starting at the bottom, were they accessible? Could you talk to them? Were they direct you?
Oh, when I was at the Tribune?
Yes, sir.
Oh, yes, very much so. That's a blessing because not only were they great writers, but they were also very welcoming. And they would, they were busy. And especially that was a boom time in Tulsa for sports because they were traveling a lot. And at that time, when the first year I was there, we had big time football. We had the Oklahoma Outlaws in the USFL. They were trying to compete with the NFL at that time. We had the number one professional soccer league in America. The Tulsa Roughnecks were in the North American Soccer League. That was like the equivalent of the MLS now. So that was big time. And so this was, all the colleges were going great. We had AAA hockey at that time. Besides pro baseball, it was really a boom period for sports in Tulsa. But we had a great staff, and yes, they were all friendly. They all, when they had time, they would all be willing to help if they saw that you were going to work hard. I mean, they didn't have any time for people who didn't work hard. Right. But if you were willing to put in the work, and they would help you, and I'm very appreciative of the help they gave me, and I treasure the relationships that I had with everyone in our sports department, and I've still maintained some of those relationships to this day.
That's good stuff, man. Salute to that. We all gotta see somebody in order to be able to be it, right? Okay, so you said you got the basketball beat when you were 24. Did I hear that right?
The high school beat when I was 24.
How was that, man? Take me through the beginning of it all the way through, basically to now, because I still know that I don't want to marginalize you and say you just do basketball, but I definitely know you from this sport.
Yes, when I said I got the high school beat, I was writing on all high school sports back then, but I was like helping out on the other sports, like in high school football. I would be writing once or twice a week. High school basketball, once high school basketball. At the Tribune, it was different than at the World. Our philosophy was at the World, one person was the head of everything. Mike Brown at that time, and for 40 years he did that, or almost 40 years, most of his 40 years there. He recently retired, but Mike Brown was it. He was the guy you turn to for high school football, high school basketball, high school everything. At the Tribune, they did it differently. You had one guy was in charge of high school football, and then he would also do high school wrestling. And then another person would do high school basketball. Back then, it was primarily 80% boys basketball. Girls basketball was still playing 6-on-6 back then. That's how far back we go. And so, and that was fine with me because I love basketball, covering basketball. And in the thing behind that was because the overlap between the seasons, that you really needed one person who could just focus on high school basketball because there was an overlap. As we know now, I mean, high school basketball starts for some schools in mid-November, and we're still going full blast in high school football. And I can see both approaches, and it's exciting for me that I get to do both now. But I can see why each paper did what they did. We wanted to do the approach the way we're doing at the World because they wanted to have one person identified as, hey, he's the person to go to if you have something for all sports. It just simplified things. And I'm thankful for that because I love covering high school basketball. I love covering high school football. So both systems have worked great for me. At high school basketball, when I was 24, that was Kevin Pritchard's senior year at Edison. And of course, he's gone on to what a career he went on to, playing the University of Kansas, now a big-time NBA executive. And he was my player of the year my first year. And Nate Harris from Booker T was my first coach of the year. There you go. In the 85-86 season. What a time. Booker T was winning its third of 4 consecutive state titles. And then the next year, Richard Dumas was the player of the year. So it was a very exciting. Lee Mayberry
Yeah.
he was a sophomore that season. I remember when the first feature story, well, one of the first game stories, I should say, I did was Lee Mayberry stole the show that night in the old Rogers gym.
See? I see. The more you talk, the more it's coming back to you. You just
Right, and so when you think of that, it's like I think the first game I covered, it was Lee Mayberry played in it, but Kevin Pritchard and a player named later an official Irvin Wilson stole the show that night, and so I think that was the first basketball game, regular season game, a high school game I covered, and then I think the next one was Lee Mayberry playing for Rogers.
You got started in a hurry, man. Just right out there, boom, feet to the fire in a good way, right?
Yes, very much in a good way.
But when you talk about interviews, how much preparation does it take for you as far as your process is concerned when you're preparing for an interview, whether it's with a coach or a player?
You definitely have to be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
Well, or at least prepared as much as you can be.
Yeah, and I guess what I mean by that is, as you know, I've been doing my podcast for a little while. Every one of my guests that I sit with, there's always like one underlying question that I want answered, or at least one underlying thing that I'm wanting to know from the conversation. And I sort of formulate the rest of, I guess, my topics based on whatever that one thing is. And so I was wanting to know if that, looks anything like what you do.
Yes, I mean, I would advise our young writers, if they were asking me about that, if they wanted tips, I'd say you need to go into, especially if it's a long form interview,
Right.
with a game plan.
Sure.
You have to have some questions already mapped out, study as much as you can. Now, it's easier to do that to an extent at the collegiate and professional levels where you've got media guides all over.
Sure.
The information isn't as readily available at the high school level, but there's still some things that ways you can prepare for an interview, even at the high school level ahead of time. And you just really need to come prepared, although it's really important to be a good listener, because they may throw something at you which totally catches you by surprise and will lead your conversation in a totally different direction. And so you wind up not using some of the questions you'd prepared and go in that direction, because that's a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
Along those lines, our Tulsa World Winter Sports Photo Day, in August when we have the Fall Sports Photo Day, that is a huge avenue for us to pick up storylines, because the student athletes who come to that, not only do we take their pictures, which can help in Player of the Week, for Player of the Week recognition and just in stories in general. Hey, if we need someone's picture, boom, we've got it because they went to Photo Day. But they're also asked to fill out an information card, and some of that is trying to generate story ideas when you ask them, who's their favorite athlete? Who's your person who's had the most influence on you? And several other questions. And a lot of story ideas, or at least icebreakers that can generate things, come from those information cards. So that's one way for us to study up for potential interviews. We've gotten a lot of good ideas through the years doing that.
And you think of an instance where you may have been nervous or a little bit anxious going into an interview, and you had to sort of, I guess, work your way through that experience, or maybe you made a blunder at one time.
I made plenty of those.
Have you really?
So you wouldn't do as many interviews as I've had throughout the years. There's some moments that I'd like to take that question back. There's certainly some mistakes I've made through the years, but that's just natural. You probably don't you teach this as a coach, that the only person who doesn't make any mistakes is someone who doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
The only person who doesn't miss shots is someone who doesn't take any.
That's right. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? And a lot of times in what you do, I would imagine a mistake by your standards could be something that whoever your subject is doesn't even catch.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And really the only mistakes that most people would catch would be if they make it into print or online. Now, the great thing about more and more things that I write being online now is that if you make the mistake, it's not forever. You can, in a lot of cases, you can correct it right away. And in a lot of things when it's online, and it's online like a typical story, say nowadays, will be online at 3:00, and our print deadline could be 8, could be 10, could be 11. And hopefully, if there's something really wrong in that story, that they'll call us before the print deadline and say, hey, you've got this wrong. And so we can go in there and have time to correct it. And that can cut down on those type of mistakes. So, yes, but am I ever nervous going into an interview? Yeah.
Even now?
Oh, even now. There's plenty of times I'm nervous, especially depending on who the person is, or the context of the situation.
Gotcha.
Or it could even be like covering a state championship game, just like the players themselves, even though I've been covering state championship games for a long time.
Never gets old.
Right. I mean, I've still got that, and I think it's good to have a little nervousness, because I want to write the best story anytime, every time. Every Friday I go cover a game, or every day I cover a game. I want it to be the best story I can be. But especially when it comes championship times, because there's more and more people going to be reading that, and this is the paper that everyone's going to save, and so you want to make it even extra special if possible. And so I feel that the pressure is self-induced pressure, because I want this to be awesome, great.
There you go. What about some moments, maybe without necessarily revealing some names, some moments where you had to go and have an interview or have a word with a coach who just took a tough loss, and they're a little bit emotional, they're a little tight about it, but it's your job, you gotta go and talk to him, and the last thing that he wants to do is be looking at you answering questions in this moment. What were some of those moments you can go back to?
Oh, I can say, well, I'll tell you a coach that I was a little intimidated by, especially when I was just starting out, was Nate Harris.
Gotcha. Someone told me you would say that.
Yeah. Even after, if they won a game, much less lost a game, right. But because he had, even though I had met him before I started covering him, that I was still, he could be an intimidating presence. I mean, I still remember how he could stare down officials.
Oh, man,
I always said that was classic. I love that. I love that. No one had a stare quite like Coach Harris. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was great. And I loved talking with Coach Harris through the years. But basically, I liked talking with Coach Harris through the years. Usually, and it wasn't like after a game, though.
Right.
My most fun times of talking with him through the years was not after a game. When he was more relaxed, because he was so intense even after they won.
Yeah.
And because I remember one time he was so upset at the officiating, he didn't want to. He told me, you got to talk to my assistant. It was Terry Yarborough.
Right.
Because I'm too upset to even talk.
Right.
And he would. But even in good times, he could stare you down, especially a young reporter like I was at 24 or 25 when I was just starting out getting to know him.
Mm-hmm. Along those same lines, was it ever a moment where you felt like, I guess some of those coaches didn't really take you that seriously because you were so new to it and so so young, so you had to earn some credibility with them? Sure,
and another coach, when I appreciated another coach, and it was Booker T's football coach at the time, Larry McGee, because I had to, basically to talk with him, I had to get Ed Lacey, who was the Tulsa Public Schools athletic director at the time, to sort of mediate that. He had to be the go-between after a game, because Coach McGee wouldn't talk with me after a game until Coach Lacey said, talk to him. So at least Coach Harris was talking to me. Right. And those weren't, there was other coaches, because it seemed like coaches throughout, I don't know, maybe it's because I was so young back then. There was just some coaches who were, it seems like more coaches are easier to talk to these days. I mean, maybe because they feel that they're more used to social media and just media in general, as opposed to when I started covering, when there's a lot of, like, lack of a better term, because I call myself old school. Yeah. To an extent. There are a lot of real old school I would say, quote, crusty coaches.
Right. The ones that take it further back than you.
Back then, longtime coaches that it was really could be intimidating back then. So, but there was also welcome, probably maybe more so in football back then.
More welcoming or less in football?
Less welcoming.
Ah, I got you.
I mean,
it's a gladiator sport, baby.
Yeah, I mean, J.W. Emerson, a great coach who, again, I wound up having some great conversations with through the years later. A lot of times I'd ask him after a football game. He was coaching Union back at the time. And I'd say, just start off with, what was the key to the game? And he'd say, we scored more points than they did.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, that's really helpful.
Yeah. He hit you with the Popovich response.
Right. And
Belichick action.
and again, had some really great conversations with him later as I got to know him.
Right.
But it seemed I ran into more football coaches who would do stuff like that after a game than I did basketball coaches. Mm-hmm. So that's why I was glad I had the basketball was my primary beat starting off with, because a lot more friendly basketball coaches. I mean, we talk about, of course, your former coach, Terry Scott.
Yes, sir.
It's always super great to talk to. Mike Bolton from McLean, John Phillips from Edison. Coaches my first year starting out. Coach Sprague, who was at Hale then, went to Memorial. Coach O'Rourke, who was at Memorial. Clyde Barkley and Inola, still going at it.
Yes, sir.
He was a coach back then, and still coaching at Inola right now. That's so awesome. So there were probably more welcoming coaches in basketball back then than football for me.
That's why basketball is the greatest sport on the planet, man. Some would argue me down with that.
But yes, it is. It can be tough, right, to talk to a losing coach after a game. It seemed tougher back then, maybe because it's not as tough now, because I've got relationships and they know who I am. But still, it can be tough sometimes. Sometimes, I mean, coaches, and I totally get it. You'll try to talk with the coach after a game and he doesn't want to talk. He's upset with how the outcome has turned out, and I understand and I respect that.
Is there a penalty that you have to, or price you have to pay for not getting that statement or that quote like you're supposed to? How does that work? Usually,
there's not a penalty for not. I mean, as long as quotes are a big part of our story.
Right.
If a coach does not want to talk with you, or if their players are not accessible, or if the deadline occurs before you can get a quote, okay, you can't get quotes. But quotes are a big part of our story. It's a big part of media coverage. You really need quotes now. And so if you can't talk to a player or a coach after a game, that really doesn't make for a very interesting story in most cases. And most of the time, that's not a problem, at least getting a quote from the winning side.
Yeah. There you go.
So, I mean, you can only try. I mean,
have you ever used your better judgment and been like, you know what? Nah, I'm not going to run up on him today. Or have you always shot the shot? Oh, yeah?
Oh, there have been times I can see it's just my instinct when I see a coach raging after a game, or if it's a hostile situation, it's like, not tonight, maybe tomorrow in a follow-up.
Yeah. What would you say is your busiest time of year? Because it doesn't seem like it ever slows down.
It doesn't slow down.
Not at all.
No, it used to be. That's a big difference between now and back when I first started, because summer was traditionally the slow time back then. Like, for example, when I first started, we would not cover high school football at all, pretty much, unless there was to report a coaching change. There was very little high school football reported on out of season. Now it's full blast high school football. I mean, there may be a few months, let's say from January, maybe from February through April.
Okay.
I was going to say February. We did our all-world and all-state, all-world football back in February this past year. So once we get past the All World Awards, which in football, which are in January or February, I think you have till about through the end of April where you're not really covering much football. But other than that, it's football the other 9 months of the year. I mean, and that's a huge difference than when I started out. And basically high school sports in general, high school sports are full blast. I mean, summer used to be a time off. There is no time off. We're going high school sports full blast 12 months out of the year.
You love it that way, don't you?
Oh, it's fun. I mean, people want high school sports. I mean, and that's our mission at the Tulsa World, is because to provide high school sports coverage no one else can give you. More in-depth coverage, and that's why we go 12 months out of the year at it. And because our mission is local sports, high schools and colleges, because you can't get that from ESPN. I mean, ESPN will do some college coverage. I mean, OU, OSU coverage, obviously. But as far as to cover them day in and day out, no one can cover OU, OSU, TU, ORU, or Tulsa area high school sports like the Tulsa World. And that's our commitment. And some people say, why don't you have more national sports? Well, you can get national sports on ESPN or USA Today or whatever national outlet, The Athletic now. But you can't get that anywhere else, really, than to the depth that we can do it than the Tulsa World.
Is it hard for you to just watch games without your thinking cap on? Like strictly as a fan?
Yes and no.
I got you. I feel the same way as a coach. Like sometimes, if it's basketball specifically, I'll be sitting up there trying to enjoy it, try to be entertained, but then after a while I start coaching. And I'm like, man, what's going on with me, man? I wonder if other people fight the same battle, so I had to ask you that.
Yes and no. There's some times that I'm not thinking about it, but although maybe that journalists thought will pop into my mind occasionally, but there's some sports that I can watch and that I'm just as a fan, and I really don't think much from a journalistic standpoint, although for the most part. But sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes it can be a challenge. Just like reading other newspapers and thinking, oh, I would have done it that way, or would have edited that other way.
That's got to be a natural thing, man. Because I'm pretty sure you can't find anything that's not yours and be like, yeah, I would have done it just like that.
Yeah, and I know as a coach, I mean, that's the challenge. Because you said, oh, I would have called that play in that situation, right, set up that shot to win the game, or switch to that defense, or whatever.
And it's always easy to do it when you're not sitting in that hot seat.
Yes.
I'm under no pressure. my judgment is clear, so I can say these things. But I got a couple more questions I want to throw at you, and I'll turn you loose, man, because I've enjoyed it. But I see the ring on your finger, so I know you're a married man. But what you do calls for a lot of turning and burning and being anywhere but the house, it seems. So how do you balance work and home?
Well, that's it's sort of a complex answer here, so I'll try to cover it as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. My wife, Deanna, she is just so wonderfully understanding, because it's no secret in journalism that there's the divorce rate in among journalists is probably higher than typical professions, just because the nature of journalism. And so I'm thankful that I have a wife who understands what I do. And that was an important part when we were dating and had our engagement. I said, we've got to go through all 4 seasons, so you know what I go through every season before we get married. So you'll know what a typical year's like. And nothing's going to surprise you once we're married. And I knew when we were dating that she's the one for me, because we went to a baseball game, took her to a baseball game, and it was cold that night. And I was willing to go home after 9 innings, because once you know it, went into extra innings. And she never said she wanted to go home. She stayed all 14 innings.
Ooh-wee.
Yeah, it's like
okay.
So
keeper.
That was a keeper. And in that summer, right after we got engaged, the World had posted some openings. They needed some part-time phone crew people to take the scores of games when they're called in on Tuesdays and Friday nights. And so she applied for that job. I did not tell her sports editor at the time that she was applying, and at that time we weren't married, so she just went by her maiden name. No one knew about the connection between us. She went and got the job on her own. Yeah. That was in 2005, and she's still doing it in 2022. So she's been there 17 years, still answering the phones. So if coaches call in scores, she's the voice that you hear. And when it's time most times to call the weekly student picker, which you know a little bit about, she's the one calling the student picker. I say that because you were one of our first ever student pickers when we started doing weekly high school football picks in 2005. But anyway, she is incredibly understanding, and she said she took the job in part so she knew that because I was spending time at the office, like, well, that'd be a way at least to see me a lot of times. But when I get home, as much as I can, I'll probably pass up watching some sporting events. I'm not watching ESPN all the time when I'm at home, and because there are other things we like to do together. We like to watch a lot of non-sports TV programming together. So
I'm getting better.
Trying to yes, that can be a challenge. It can be so tempting because, I could watch sports all the time, but we like a lot of crime dramas.
Yeah, there you go.
And so that's something we both have in common. And so, okay, instead of watching Monday Night Football some week or some baseball game every night, okay, let's watch Law and Order. Let's watch NCIS. You name the show. So I think that's trying to find a balance.
Right.
Even though sometimes I am multitasking because there's a lot of times when I'm having to do work at home at night, and so I'll be watching the show while typing away on my laptop. But although I really, some shows are easier to watch than others when you're working and having it as background. But when I get to my favorite shows, though, I really like to focus on those shows and not be pounding away on the laptop. But sometimes you got to do it.
And you sort of answered my next question, which was going to be, what are some of your hobbies? Like, how do you decompress whenever you're out of work mode? Some of the fun stuff we can find Barry Lewis doing.
Well, I love golfing, but I don't have much time to golf. So I try to make time every day to do at least a 30 or 40 minute walk.
That's big.
That time is important. Prayer time is important. Going to church is important. And then we talked about the TV shows. Yeah. And you talk about how do you balance work and work and home life. Try to have at least one meal every day with my wife Deanna. Okay, she really got me into doing that early on in our marriage, stressing the importance of it. And I'm totally on board with that. The importance of at least having one meal every day together. And so that's important. So those are ways to sort of decompress, and also going to sporting events just as a fan.
So there is such a thing.
Yeah. Oh yes. Going to don't get to do this very often. Going to a production at the PAC.
Oh yeah. I used to love those when my grandma was
and going to a movie occasionally, going to a concert occasionally. All those things.
That's awesome, man. Well, here's how we'll wrap this thing up. What is, if you can think back to just one, okay, in baseball at any level, football at any level, basketball at any level, the greatest game that you got to witness while you were on the job?
On the job, see, that's an important distinction.
Yes, sir.
Greatest game on the job.
But it was the atmosphere, the whole nine. Like, I remember this one.
Because I wasn't on the job. The greatest game I've ever been to would have been Game 6 of the 2011 World Series, but I was not on the job for that.
That's still awesome, though.
I would say the greatest sports coverage that as far as a big time event, the way I'd say my number one, I would rank this past PGA Championship as far as how I feel, how I performed, and how the event turned out, and what it did for the city of Tulsa. It was a great week for the city of Tulsa. I think it was a great week for our coverage at the Tulsa World, which I helped direct and report on. And I'd covered other majors before, but it was and the outcome was it was such an exciting event going into not a sudden death playoff, but to a 3-hole playoff. Had a great champion. It was an incredibly hard, long week. Spent 90 hours that week at Southern Hills. I was up every morning at 4:30 and didn't get home at 4:30 in the morning, and didn't get home till 11:30 during the tournament. But it was all worth it, because I thought, to us, from a journalist standpoint, it was our Super Bowl. And I thought, I guess it's the closest I could feel to us winning a Super Bowl that we had that week. And we've had also other great weeks covering major golf tournaments. And it was such a team effort. It's such great contributions from everyone on the sports staff. And to be a part of a great team effort, that was really huge to be a part of that. And so, because the event it is, because the eyes of the world were on that,
yes,
I would say, I guess that ranks number one. I've been blessed reporting on Major League playoff games, NBA playoff games, Major League All-Star games, and so many, of course, great high school state championship games and college events. So it's really tough to pick one, but I'm going to go with the 2022 PGA.
Listen, man, I can't contest that, and I won't try to, man. But Barry Lewis, thank you for coming through here and giving us some of your time. I've known you for some years. I've admired you for just as long, and I'm always rooting for you. So hopefully you can have the mic in my face after a couple good games this coming up year for the Braves.
We'll look forward to it.
Yes, sir.